Thanks for listening to One Concerned American. On today's episode, I want to cover one of the most controversial figures in American history, Andrew Johnson. Now, a lot of people know that Johnson was the first president impeached in American history, and he has kind of a bad reputation, but I'm going to show you that he was actually one of the most conservative presidents in American history, and there's many things of value that we can take away from his life and his career. For example, a lot of people don't know that Andrew Johnson was actually born into poverty in rural North Carolina. If you study this man's life, his father died when he was really young. Andrew Johnson actually took on a job as a tailor's apprentice at a very early age. Okay? For most of his life, he was poorly educated until he met his wife, who helped him learn how to read and write, and he did this while he was still working as a tailor. The historian Charles Ramsdale Langley described Johnson as a compact, sturdy figure, his eyes black, his complexion swarthy, and as a tenacious man, possessed of a rude intellectual force, a rough and ready stump speaker, intensely loyal, industrious, sincere, and self-reliant. And if you study Andrew Johnson, folks, he came into the presidency at the most difficult time. Lincoln had just been assassinated, and most people at that time only knew him for actually being drunk at Lincoln's second inauguration. So there were some embarrassing moments in his career, and he kind of had a reputation as being a bit of a drunk and a conspiracy theorist. But I'm going to show you that he tried to save this country, folks, and he's one of the only presidents in American history that actually spoke up about people within our government that were trying to destroy the very foundations of our constitutional republic. So let's get started here. First, you got to remember that when Andrew Johnson became the president, he was basically at odds with the radical Republicans from the very beginning. You're talking about guys like Thaddeus Stevens, Charles Sumner. They basically wanted to suspend the United States Constitution and place the South under strict military law, confiscate all the land. So they basically wanted to rework everything and make it in their own image. And Johnson, if you actually study his plan, you can look at this chart here. His system was very similar to Lincoln's. All he basically asked the states to do that had seceded was to ratify the 13th Amendment and recognize the end of slavery. And then if you requested a pardon, he would pretty much grant it to you. And that kind of humiliated some of the Southern elite, but he blamed a lot of them for the Civil War and for secession. Now, if you look at Johnson's views on Reconstruction, he actually had some pretty unique thoughts on this. You can see here that he said, "There is no such thing as Reconstruction. These states have not gone out of the Union, therefore Reconstruction is unnecessary." Now, this is really interesting because, again, if you study the radical Republicans, they all thought that the South should be placed under military law, and they should be basically forced to ratify the 14th Amendment. Now, if you go and look at the 14th Amendment, it's very interesting because it says that all persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States. Now, before this, ladies and gentlemen, you were just a citizen of your state. And this is very important because you can see right out through this language that it was making a whole new class of citizen, the United States citizen, and that these people would be subject to the government of the United States. Now, this is why Andrew Johnson was at odds with the radical Republicans. He had a very strict interpretation of the Constitution. He didn't believe that citizens of the United States were meant to be interpreted as subjects, okay? And these types of interpretations constantly brought him up to odds with the radical Republicans. As a matter of fact, I believe if you study Johnson, nobody ever vetoed more legislation before him because he saw all this wasteful spending, he saw a lot of corruption, and when he spoke out about it, people just said he was a drunk conspiracy theorist and they attacked him. And these are things that we'll get into in this video. For example, you can see the book The Great Conspiracy, Its Origin and History by John Logan. He noted that Andrew Johnson was quoted as having said, "There has been a deliberate design for years to change the nature and genius of this government." You've also got the book To the Victor Go the Myths and Monuments by Arthur Thompson. And you can see he's writing here that Johnson claimed that there was a conspiracy in the radical Republican Congress to bring about an autocracy or dictatorship, and that they had organized riots in the South, specifically New Orleans, as part of this plan, to give an excuse for continued and increased military crackdown over the Southern civilian population. So, Johnson was saying that the radical Republicans were placing provocateurs throughout the South, basically, starting riots so that they could create order out of chaos and bring military martial law to the South. Okay? And he disagreed with this, and this is part of the reason Congress tried to impeach him. Now, I want to break down for you 4 main reasons that Johnson was impeached, because again, just like Donald Trump, he was brought up on charges by the House, but he wasn't convicted in the Senate. And when you look at all the charges they brought Johnson up on, they're totally bogus. For example, look at number 1. One of the main reasons that Johnson was brought up on these charges was that he fired Edwin Stanton, and that this was contrary to the Tenure of Office Act. If you go back and study it, folks, Edwin Stanton actually helped author this act himself. And Edwin Stanton was actually a madman. I mean, notice if you see this cartoon here, he's actually ramming this cannon that's getting ready to fire at Andrew Johnson. And just real quick, I want to tell you a brief history of Stanton. He lived in a boarding house in Columbus, Ohio, managed a bookstore, and was infatuated with the daughter of the boarding house's owner. One day she fell ill and died rapidly of cholera. As was the practice at that time, victims of cholera were interred as rapidly as possible to prevent the spread of the disease. So Stanton left for work early in the morning, and by the time he came home, she had exhibited the symptoms of the disease, died, and been buried. It was not unusual for people to exhibit the symptoms of cholera and die within 8 hours. He could not believe that she was dead and disinterred her to make sure. Years later, in 1841, after his daughter had died and been buried for a year, he had the body exhumed and laid out in a special metal container for another year in his living room. His wife died in 1844, and for a short time he kept dressing and undressing her in her wedding gown, also in the living room. At night, he arranged his wife's nightcap and gown beside him in bed. He finally was persuaded by friends to bury both together. And madness did run in the Stanton family. His brother Darwin actually did kill himself by slitting his own throat. So this cartoon is not exaggerating here. I mean, this guy probably would have killed Andrew Johnson had he the chance. And he's implicated by several historians as having been involved in Lincoln's assassination. And at the end of this video, we will cover some facts about the Lincoln assassination. Now, the second reason that Johnson was brought up on charges, again, I think there were about 11 charges altogether, but they basically centered around these 4 main reasons. So the second reason was that he declared certain parts of a congressional act unconstitutional. And that refers to the Freedmen's Bureau. I'm actually going to read to you what he said about the Freedmen's Bureau in just a second. So stay tuned about that. Congress said that he attempted to bring them into disgrace through his speeches. Again, he was actually exposing corruption and trying to show that there were people trying to destroy the Constitution. And then number 4, they said he generally opposed the execution of several acts of Congress. So we're going to kind of go over that these were all bogus charges. It's pretty much the reason why he was acquitted, just like Donald Trump, just like Bill Clinton. One of the main things that Johnson always gets criticism for is his opposition to the Freedmen's Bureau. And people think that he must have been anti-equality since he opposed the Freedmen's Bureau. But listen to what he said about this, okay? And this is very important. I need you to pay attention here. He says, "The rebellion commenced and the slaves were turned loose. Then we come to the Freedmen's Bureau bill, and what did the bill propose? It proposed to appoint agents and sub-agents in all the cities, counties, schools, districts, and parishes, with power to make contracts for all the slaves, power to control and power to hire them out, dispose of them, and in addition to that, the whole military power of the government applied to carry it into execution. 4 million slaves were emancipated and given an equal chance and fair start to make their own support to work and produce, and having worked and produced, to have their own property and apply it to their own support." And this is where it gets really important here. I need you to really focus in on the numbers here. He says, but the Freedmen's Bureau comes and says, we must take charge of these 4 million slaves. The Bureau comes along and proposes at an expense of a fraction less than 12 million a year to take charge of these slaves. You had already expended 3 billion to set them free and give them fair opportunity to take care of themselves. Then these gentlemen, who are such great friends of the people, tell us they must be taxed 12 million to sustain the Freedmen's Bureau. So Johnson had no problem with equality, folks. Again, recognizing the end of slavery was his only condition to come back into the Union. And he actually supported the right of black Union veterans to be able to vote. So when it comes down to it, he wasn't any worse on race than Abraham Lincoln, and that's a fact. You can take that to the bank. There were also 3 main reasons that Johnson was opposed to the Freedmen's Bureau, and these are kind of things that were laid out in the quote that I just read to you, but I just want to break it down. Johnson was against a military government of the South. He was against the unlimited distribution of funds to former slaves and their families, and he was against taking land away from Southerners. And because all of these things were happening in the Congress, it caused an even more reactionary South to backlash. And because of all these changes that happened during Reconstruction, you saw the rise of groups like the Ku Klux Klan. You saw a rise in groups like the Union League, which were doing things just like the Ku Klux Klan, but they were working for the radical Republicans. If it hadn't been for all the changes that took place during Reconstruction, you wouldn't have had the rise of the Solid South. Things like the Dixiecrats, where these guys fought to keep segregation well into the 1960s. The reason that these things happened was because of a backlash of Southerners after the war. Okay? They lost a lot of their land. The people that used to be their property started getting more rights and started getting more freedoms and money. You had provocateurs on both sides that were coming in with the Klan and the Union League. So there was a lot of violence. Just like Johnson said, there were people on both sides that were trying to cause chaos all the time. If you take a good look at this cartoon here, it shows that Johnson actually did care, especially about the black soldiers who had fought for the Union. This cartoon shows black Union soldiers coming to ask for their money, and they're being paid promptly. And then they're showing white soldiers actually getting paid less and actually not being able to receive their money. So, just one more thing I want to show you about the Freedmen's Bureau, again, to show you that this wasn't to do anything with equality, why he opposed it. It was because of the money and the power that it was giving to the government. If you read this quote, it says that there is an attempt to concentrate the power of the government in the hands of a few, and thereby bring about a consolidation, which is equally dangerous and objectionable with separation. We find that, in fact, by an irresponsible central directory, nearly all the powers of government are assumed without even consulting the legislative or executive departments of the government. Now, if you read that quote and apply it to what's going on today, this is exactly what Donald Trump is talking about with the deep state, how there's all these people who are spying on him and he can't get anything done because there's a shadow government working against him. This is literally what Johnson was talking about. And if you look at the cartoons here, they just mocked him. You can see the cartoon on the left shows him as a parakeet just saying, Constitution, Constitution, right? Like he's a retard. You can see he looks like a poor little hobbit on the right, holding the Constitution under his arm like a defeated man. So these guys portrayed him again as a drunk conspiracy theorist who was clinging to the Constitution when he should have been a lot more radical. Okay? And if you study Johnson, he just tried to play it down the middle, guys. He tried to bring this country together. He tried to talk about the people who were really dividing us even after the war. And because of these things, he's actually been labeled as one of the worst presidents. Here you can actually see a cartoon that shows Thaddeus Stevens on the left representing the radical Republicans, and he's riding on the back of a former slave. Okay? And then it shows Johnson on the right holding the Constitution. And what this represents is that the radical Republicans, they didn't actually care about the black people that were freed through the Civil War. Okay? They cared about their votes. At the end of the day, the Republican Party has always been an electioneering machine. That's why two of their biggest presidents ever from their party have been actors. Go and study the Republican Party, people. If you look at the history, it was founded in a commune that was built by the American Union of Associations, and this was located in Ripon, Wisconsin. And that's where the Republican Party was founded, literally in a socialist commune. Okay? So moving on, I just want to talk one more time about these parallels between Andrew Johnson and Donald Trump's presidencies. And this is a quote from the book To the Victor Go the Myths and Monuments by Arthur Thompson. You can see here it says, agitators were organized to shout Johnson down until he was forced to quit the swing, as the tour was known, referring to the swing around the bulk of the northern populated areas. By the time he appeared in Indianapolis, the hecklers opened the meeting by tearing down the transparencies, firing shots, killing one man and wounding others, and forcing the president to quit the place without uttering a word. Similar tactics were used in the 2016 presidential election. So, Johnson was going out giving speeches, trying to tell people about what was going on, and there were literally hecklers that were working with the radical Republicans and whatever other secret societies that were telling these people to go out, and they were trying to shout him down. And he would actually give it back to him. He would actually yell right back and try to yell over them. So again, this kind of made him come off and seem very unrefined. He's just a drunk. That was basically what people said at the time. He must be drinking, right? Because he's trying to tell you about corruption going on. Here's another quote, and this is very interesting because if you look at the cartoon on the right, this is supposed to be Johnson celebrating his acquittal from the impeachment trial, and he's got a bottle of bourbon in one hand, and he looks like a king. But listen to what he actually said about the size of the government. Johnson said, quote, "We have witnessed in one department of the government every endeavor to prevent the restoration of peace, harmony, and union. We have seen hanging upon the verge of the government, as it were, a body called, or which assumes to be the Congress of the United States, while in fact is step and act tended to perpetuate disunion and make a disruption of the states inevitable. We have seen Congress gradually encroach, step by step, upon the constitutional rights and violate day after day and month after month fundamental principles of the government. We have seen a Congress in a minority assume to exercise power which, allowed to be consummated, would result in despotism or monarchy himself." So Johnson actually said that there are people in the government acting like kings who are overstepping the whole system of checks and balances. And what did the media do? The media reported him as a tyrant, right? They sketched him out as a king. They tried to say that he was abusing his power. And he's one of the only people in history that tried to expose the corruption, okay? One of the last things I want to talk about with Johnson is the fact that many people believe he was involved in Lincoln's assassination. Now, I want to go over just a few facts with you, and I think if you consider all these things together, what I've shared with you before this and what you'll see after this, I think pretty conclusively there's evidence that he wasn't involved with the assassination. For example, James Monroe Ashley, who you see on the bottom right corner, he submitted the first bill of impeachment against Johnson, trying to prove that he was involved in Lincoln's assassination, and the bill was defeated. Many historians believe Edwin Stanton played a role because his office controlled the telegraph lines out of Washington. Again, Stanton, you can see, is in the photo on the top right. The Surgeon General J.K. Barnes, a student of George Bancroft's Round Hill School, cut a section of vertebra from John Wilkes Booth's spinal column in the neck, and this actually prevented proper identification. J.K. Barnes is the gentleman in the bottom left-hand photograph, and it's interesting because if you've watched my videos on the conspiratorial history of the United States, I shared with you that George Bancroft actually went to Göttingen University, which was where Adam Weishaupt, the founder of the Illuminati, taught. So it's very interesting that you can draw a direct line from the Illuminati to the Lincoln assassination through this Surgeon General, who actually altered John Wilkes Booth's supposed body in some way. Now, there's also no record of an autopsy within the Army and Navy Medical Museum, which should have a copy if there were an autopsy report. We also have the fact that Booth's sister claimed that John remained alive for many years after his death. Few more odd facts. Again, a lot of people know that John Wilkes Booth, who was Lincoln's killer, he was an actor. And then later on, he was shot and killed by a man named Thomas P. Corbett. And if you study Corbett, his photo is on the top left. He was actually known for sexual deviance. And at one point, he was treated at a Massachusetts General Hospital for self-castration. Okay? This man became a preacher. He consorted with prostitutes. I mean, he was a real sick man. And he never got punished for killing Lincoln's assassin. And they even gave him a portion of the award money. So if you look at the illustration on the bottom left, you can see John Wilkes Booth is trapped in this burning building, and Corbett actually shot him. I mean, does that make any sense? Doesn't that sound like a cover-up? If you actually look at all the evidence, John Wilkes Booth probably did live, and that's why whatever body they had, they altered so that they could say it was John Wilkes Booth. They killed someone else or found another dead body. They took out some bones so that it would look more like him. Then they passed it off as his real body. I mean, it's not that hard to do. They did some similar things with the Kennedy assassination. And just some other facts to back this up. If you look on June 16th, 1866, B.G. Harris of Maryland said in a speech to the House that Booth's body was not intact and that his skull, heart, and spine were in 3 different locations. We also have the fact that Booth's body was allegedly photographed, but the plate and print were confiscated as soon as they were made and never seen again. So, when you add all this up with the fact that Johnson was one of the only people actually speaking up about the conspiracies working our government, it seems unlikely to me that he was directly involved, but there is a little bit of suspicion when it comes to the people that were pardoned that were involved with Lincoln's assassination. Now, if you don't know, the first woman ever executed in American history was named Mary Surratt, and you can see her photographed here on the left. And she was actually killed because she owned a tavern where some of the people involved in the plot met. And Andrew Johnson was quoted many years after the war as saying that the execution of Mrs. Surratt was a crime of passion without justice or reason. And if you go on, Johnson actually pardoned 3 other people that were involved with the Lincoln assassination. Now, again, I think the reason is that when you look at the evidence, it's not evidence that directly implicates them in the murder. Like some of these people might have talked to Booth after he escaped, or they might have talked with him before. They might have known something, but they probably weren't directly involved. So I think that's why he pardoned them. I don't think it was part of anything much bigger than that. But a lot of people will continue to talk. And I wanted to kind of wrap up with this photograph here. If you look at this picture, it shows Lady Liberty, and she's talking with Andrew Johnson, who is holding this black kettle, and it says the Reconstructed South. And you can see that it's got chinks all through it, it's leaking water all over the place, and he looks very sad. This, to me, kind of describes Johnson, because when I study him, I see someone that was trying to fix this country, someone who was speaking up about a lot of the things that were going wrong and how we were going away from the Constitution. Was he perfect on equality? No. Was he an occasional drunk? Yes. But you have to take some of these good things with the bad, and I think when you weigh everything all together, I think Johnson is actually a very underappreciated president that we need to look back to occasionally. Now, the last thing I will say that is my biggest criticism of Andrew Johnson is that if you do study his link to Freemasonry, there's where you see some suspicious activity. This is a quote from the book The Ugly Truth About the Anti-Defamation League, and this is from the Executive Intelligence Review, so I can tell you this research has been duplicated, and it is a fact. With the defeat of Lincoln's Reconstruction program following his assassination, President Andrew Johnson pardoned the Scottish Rite insurrectionists, including General Albert Pike, and accepted a rank of 32nd degree Freemason in the Southern Jurisdiction. Suspected Lincoln assassination plotter Simon Wolfe was also absolved of any criminal culpability for his wartime activities. So that puts it at about 4 people that Johnson pardoned that are alleged to have been involved with Lincoln's assassination. So it is a little bit suspicious, especially when you consider that he pardoned Albert Pike, because we all know that Pike is one of the moneyed founders of the Ku Klux Klan. We know that Pike has written many things exposing that Freemasonry does acknowledge Lucifer as their god. So some of these things are kind of disturbing. And if I do have any seeds of doubt about Andrew Johnson, it's through this link with the Freemasons. So with all that being said, again, I think that Johnson was one of the most conservative presidents we've ever had. He was probably the most devoted to the Constitution we've ever had any president be. And I think for those reasons alone, we need to study him a little bit further. Again, the parallels between his impeachment and Trump's are pretty stark. So he's a figure that's very forgotten in history, and we need to remember him. Now, I wanted to close by saying, please check out my Patreon if you haven't already. I'm an independent historian and a teacher, and I'm trying to make these videos to wake the sheeple and empower the people. So anything you can donate will help. Again, if you donate $1 recurrently to this channel, I will share my digital library with you, and you will have access to all the content that I discuss in my videos. So please consider donating to this channel. I mean, again, I have a 3-year-old daughter. Everything helps right now. I don't make a lot of money with the teaching. So every little bit helps, and it helps me make good content. It helps me find more work to research and to share with you. And it will give you a lot of material that you can sift through yourself to kind of discern what's going on with the world. So I really appreciate everybody who participates and comments. Please consider liking this video and subscribing if you haven't already. And sharing the video will also help this information go a long way. So thanks, and God bless, guys.